Many of you probably know or have heard of Jaws, the scary man-eating shark, but has anyone heard of this scary infectious disease called Yaws?
Jaws is arguably one of the gnarliest movies of all time, but we're here to tell you all about Yaws, which is a pretty gnarly phenomenon in and of itself.
Yeah, let's get into it. Tell us what we need to know about this Yaws.
So Yaws is a neglected tropical disease caused by a close relative of syphilis called Treponema pallidum pertinu. Individuals affected by Yaws can experience skin lesions and swelling of the bones and joints. The primary mode of transmission is direct contact from person to person. Young children are most susceptible.
Well, that's a mouthful, and I have another one. There are about 65,000 cases of Yaws that occur each year across 13 endemic countries, most of which are located in Africa and Southern Asia. 85% of those cases occur in Papua New Guinea, Ghana, and the Solomon Islands. This means that Yaws is regularly occurring in those countries. In the 1950s, the World Health Organization and UNICEF led a mass drug administration of benzathine benzylpenicillin, greatly reducing the number of annual cases.
And by 95%. So that 65,000 number is a result of much action by global health organizations. We'll take a deeper look into these efforts later into the episode.
But for now, let's talk about where Yaws came from. Where did it originate and what did it look like?
So, the name Yaws is believed to have originated from the indigenous Caribbean word yaya, meaning sores. The disease itself is ancient and has been believed to have originated in the Old World continents of Africa or Asia. Later, the disease spread to the Americas.
Now, there are a few important events along the timeline of Yaws since it's originated. Let's imagine it's 1905. The Italian bacteriologist Aldo Castellani identified Treponema pallidum subspecies pertinu as the causative agent. Between the 50s and 60s, Yaws infected 50 million people until the WHO launched their eradication campaign. The campaign successfully reduced infections to 2.5 million.
The WHO's campaign was largely successful in its initial introduction, but we saw a resurgence in West and Central Africa due to lack of monitoring efforts between the 1970s and 80s. Control measures were consequently implemented and cases returned to a decline.
Fast forward to the 2000s. Yaws was still a threat, but mostly remained in West Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central Africa. These areas tend to provide optimal conditions for Yaws to spread as they have overpopulated areas, poor sanitation, poor water health, and limited healthcare access.
Yeah, so looking into the present day, Yaws annual cases sit around 15,000.
Okay, now that we've given you some background and baseline information, we can get into the nitty-gritty details of Yaws biology.
Let's get started.
I can start us off. Treponema pallidum pertinu, the causative agent previously discussed, is a subspecies within the pertinu species. The disease is not known to affect species other than humans, though.
Typically, the infection enters through even the smallest of cuts and scratches. After 9 to 90 days, a skin response can form around that scratch site.
So you're telling me that this minuscule scratch I have on my finger right now could put me at a greater risk for getting these skin lesions and bone infections?
Yep, that's how these diseases survive. They target susceptible individuals even if it means having half an inch long cut. That's what makes it so infectious.
Okay, so let's talk about the life cycle stages. In its early stages, Yaws starts as a small wart-like papilloma. Weeks to a few months later, one could start seeing many raised lesions and pain or swelling of the bones. The last or tertiary stage can be characterized by a chronic disfigurement and eventually disability related to deformed bones and or cartilage.
So overall, we're looking at signs of morbidity like skin ulcers and bone and joint pain that can lead to deformity and chronic disability. However, even though the infection negatively impacts quality of life, the infection is not fatal. Additionally, there are little effects on reproductive health, considering that most of the cases affect children.
Okay, so we know about morbidity, mortality, susceptibility, and everything else. let's talk about how Yaws is being studied.
So, the pathogen itself can't be cultured in vitro. It's studied using dark field microscopy, serological testing, and PCR.
We can also talk about the pathogen's susceptibility to disease itself. There's no known evidence that Treponema pallidum pertinu can be infected by other pathogens. Its unique intracellular and cellular lifestyle actually make it less susceptible to infection.
Okay, I feel like we've covered a lot of the bases thus far in this episode. So what don't we know?
How about we change that question to go even deeper? What don't we know that maybe we should know?
Oh, I like that. Maybe we should start with the topic of antibiotics. So we know that Yaws is being treated with antibiotics penicillin and azithromycin. While these have been effective, antibiotic-resistant strains are becoming increasingly prevalent, so that's something to definitely watch out for.
Yeah, this is such an important topic to cover, especially nowadays as we're seeing more and more antibiotic resistance, not only in strains of Yaws, but also many other bacterial diseases. In fact, resistance could be a gateway to a new epidemic and eventually a pandemic. So yeah, antibiotic resistance is definitely worth bringing up in this discussion, among any others.
Agreed. I guess I'll add on to that by saying there tends to be limited genetic data on regional strains of causing Yaws. In general, there's a great lack of global genetic analysis and collaboration. So if we had more collaboration between global entities, we would be better able to compare strains and therefore target and track the progression of Yaws globally.
This is something that continues to be a relevant issue in the world of epidemiology and other areas of science as well.
So, we already talked briefly in the intro about eradication efforts, but we have more details to discuss.
We talked about UNICEF and the WHO eradication program that was launched in 1952. This involved mass administration of the antibiotic penicillin. The disease did end up resurging beginning in the 70s due to poor monitoring by the WHO. In 2012, renewed eradication measures were implemented. This involved mass drug administration of single doses of azithromycin.
So, come 2020, the WHO experienced a lack of funding, largely due to the funding that was being pooled to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. Barriers today beyond funding include poor healthcare infrastructure, limited surveillance measures, and of course, antibiotic resistance. We're still seeing the use of mass drug administration and monitoring using PCR testing.
Yeah, I think funding is a key issue to bring up, especially when talking about these neglected tropical diseases like Yaws. Lack of funding is one of the reasons why these sets of diseases have been called neglected. They tend to occur in the tropics where poverty rates are high and health resources are low. Because the areas most impacted by these diseases are so poor, the market for drug manufacturing is less favorable. Thus, we tend to see a significantly lower spending on research and monitoring for these diseases.
Despite this lack of funding and research relative to other diseases, Yaws has been well studied in terms of representation in research and journals. Of course, in comparison to other high-priority diseases like COVID-19 and influenza, there's no competition.
We do have several treatments, including antibiotics, that have been used effectively, as well as nucleotide sequences for the bacterial agent. At the end of the day, the ability to eradicate a disease comes down to monitoring efforts, which have been inconsistent in the case of Yaws.
Right, and these inconsistencies aren't simply giving people small skin lesions and occasional pain. This disease, although not fatal, has a tremendous impact on disability-adjusted life years. Additionally, many experience chronic pain and deformities that prevent them from attending school or work.
And when we look at these cases of disability and productivity at a larger scale, whole economies are impacted for years to come. Many affected are unable to accept physically demanding jobs in these countries where laborious jobs are easier found. Job availability can then strain a family's ability to pay for various treatments and health visits. So the economic impacts are truly devastating on both the individual and the collective level in endemic countries.
And even beyond the economic strain Yaws has on families and economies, social relationships can also be a big issue. Remember how we discussed Yaws as a relative of syphilis? Well, a lot of communities have really held on to that fact and tend to associate yaws with promiscuity due to its close relation. Yaws infected individuals also tend to be denoted as unclean.
We also see strains on childcare and school attendance, particularly in young children who are the most susceptible age group.
Yeah, so we see many impacts of yaws in terms of social and economic life. I think one of the main takeaways from this episode is that while yaws might have a low mortality rate, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not majorly impacting people's daily lives, and in big ways. Furthermore, the fact that yaws has yet to be eradicated and is given little attention on the global scale just proves that this is largely a disease of poverty.
Yeah, these impoverished areas are so vulnerable and underrepresented. Unfortunately, it seems the global economy doesn't support the representation of these groups, despite how detrimental the effects of yaws can be on the livelihoods of many.
I think we covered some great points here in this episode. I hope you can all take away something not only about yaws, but be able to apply the greater social and economic impact that infectious disease can have on both various populations throughout the world and in your own communities.
I completely agree. Thank you for listening to our discussion about yaws.
We'll see you next time.